The signal that started everything was not a threat. That was the part that made it so difficult to classify afterward, when the conclave's review boards attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events and assign causation to the appropriate parties. The signal was administrative in nature, a standard Class IV retrieval notification, the kind broadcast thousands of times each cycle across contested and unclaimed space. It carried no hostility. It carried no ultimatum. It carried, in the precise and formal language of conclave territorial law, a simple statement of intent that the designated recovery vessel's Cerethis Accord would arrive at coordinates matching the third planetary body of the system, cataloged as Helix 7 within 14 standard days, and that any biological or material assets registered under conclave jurisdiction would be collected and returned to their point of origin. Standard procedure. Unremarkable. Logged and forgotten by the mid-tier bureaucrat who approved it before moving on to the next file in the queue. What that bureaucrat had not done, what no one in the chain of approval had done, was read the secondary notation attached to the system's survey entry. It was old data collected during a pass-through scan nearly 60 years prior, when Helix 7 had been flagged as low value, no strategic minerals, no navigable anomalies, no species presence above a Class II complexity threshold. The notation simply read, indigenous population, pre-contact, developmental stage uncertain, no conclave affiliation. That last part was the critical phrase, because it meant that anything arriving in that system from conclave space, any research drone, any automated relay buoy, any habitat module that had drifted off course, was legally retrievable without negotiation, without notice to the population, without any protocol beyond the filing of the appropriate form which had already been filed, stamped, and approved. The item being retrieved was a single navigation anchor, a piece of equipment roughly the size of a large shed that had been deployed in the outer belt of Helix 7 as part of a survey chain 43 years ago. The anchor had since drifted inward, caught in the gravitational relationship between the system's third and fourth planets, and was now sitting in a lazy elliptical orbit that occasionally brought it within scanning range of the third planet's surface. Someone had finally noticed it on a routine audit, determined it was recoverable, and dispatched the Cerethis Accord to go get it. The crew of the Cerethis Accord consisted of 7. The vessel's captain was a Vaithri named Osun, whose species processed information in a manner that humans would have found unsettling, not because they were cold, but because they were precise in a way that left no room for ambiguity. Osun did not dislike the assignment. She did not like it either. She cataloged it as a task of moderate difficulty requiring minimal risk, completed the pre-departure checks with her crew, and departed for Helix 7 with a trajectory that would land them ahead of schedule by approximately 2 days. What none of them expected was the signal they received when they crossed into the outer system boundary. It was not conclave formatted. It was not using any recognized encryption or transmission protocol. It was, by every metric their communication systems could parse, primitive, broadcast on a wideband frequency across multiple electromagnetic wavelengths simultaneously, as though whoever was sending it wasn't certain which channel would work and had decided to try all of them at once. The Universal Translation module took 11 minutes to establish a working framework, and when it finally produced a coherent rendering, Osun read it twice before calling her communications officer over to verify the output. The message said, "This is Commander Yael Doffin of the Helix Station Deep Watch. We have been observing your approach vector for 6 days. You are entering declared human space. State your designation and purpose immediately, or we will consider your approach hostile. This is your only courtesy notification." Osun's first response was to cross-reference the term human against the conclave species database. She found the entry for Helix 7's indigenous population, which confirmed the pre-contact designation and noted the estimated technological development as low to moderate, confined almost entirely to their home planet, with some evidence of rudimentary orbital activity. She then looked at the phrase, declared human space, and experienced something that, in a D3, most closely resembled polite confusion. They had declared space. A pre-contact species, not yet part of any recognized galactic governance structure, had declared that the space surrounding their world belonged to them. This was not how it worked. The Conclave's framework for territorial claims required membership, registration, a formal application process that took decades under the best circumstances, and assumed the applying species had already achieved a minimum threshold of interstellar travel. These humans had achieved none of that. They had, apparently, simply decided that the space around their planet was theirs and sent a message saying so. Ozuan composed a response. She was a precise and fair individual, and she had no wish to cause alarm where none was necessary. She explained in measured terms that the Serethis Accord was operating under a valid conclave retrieval mandate for a piece of registered equipment currently in orbit of Helix 7's third planetary body. She explained that this was a legal and administrative procedure, not an act of territorial incursion. She explained that under conclave law, the equipment in question was registered property and its recovery did not require the consent of non-affiliated parties. She kept the tone respectful. She did not use condescending language, though several members of her crew later noted that the message, while technically accurate, may not have fully appreciated the perspective of the recipients. The response came back in 4 hours. It was considerably shorter than her message. Commander Devon speaking. I understand what you've said. You've told us you're coming to take something. You've told us we have no legal standing to object. And you've told us this is already decided. I want to make sure you understand our response. If you cross the lunar orbital threshold, we will treat it as an act of aggression and respond accordingly. We have 17 armed vessels in this system. This is not a negotiation. This is information you need before you make your next decision. Ozuan verified the orbital scan data. There were, in fact, 17 distinct signatures matching artificial craft in the system, most of them clustered in orbital patterns around the third planet, 2 of them positioned in the outer belt near the location of the navigation anchor. The craft were small by conclave standards, nothing in the inventory that would have qualified as a warship under interstellar classification, but they were armed. She could detect energy signatures consistent with directed force weapons and what appeared to be kinetic launch systems. She studied the data for a long time. The political calculus, from a Vathri perspective, was not complicated. The Serethis Accord was a retrieval vessel. It was not a combat ship. It had defensive shielding, adequate to deflect debris and moderate energy impacts, and it had 2 short-range interdiction emitters designed for clearing hazardous material from a flight path. It was not equipped to engage 17 vessels, regardless of their individual capability. The retrieval mandate did not authorize hostile engagement. The correct action, procedurally, was to notify the Conclave's Regional Administrative Office that the retrieval had been complicated by unexpected indigenous activity, request a determination on how to proceed, and hold position outside the contested threshold until guidance arrived. This is what Ozuan did. She sent the notification, entered a holding pattern at the system's outer boundary, and waited. What happened during that waiting period was not something she had any mechanism to anticipate. The report she had sent triggered a standard review. The review escalated because the combination of a pre-contact species, an unauthorized territorial claim, and an unresolved retrieval mandate fell into a category of institutional complexity that required multiple departments to weigh in. The Conclave's Territorial Division, its Species Contact Bureau, its Legal Registry, and its Enforcement Directorate all received copies. Each one began generating internal correspondence. The Territorial Division noted that the navigation anchor remained registered conclave property. The Species Contact Bureau flagged that direct enforcement action against a pre-contact population could violate the conclave's own non-interference framework, depending on how the relevant statutes were interpreted. The Legal Registry pointed out that the Human's Territorial Declaration had no standing under conclave law, but also noted that the conclave had never formally annexed this system, which created a murky jurisdictional situation. The Enforcement Directorate said it was standing by for direction. The process moved at the speed of institutions, which is to say, it moved very slowly. During this time, Yael Davin was not waiting. Davin was 38 years old and had spent 11 of those years working for what was formerly called the Helix Station Coordinated Defense Initiative and informally called the Watch, a coalition of orbital platforms, refitted cargo vessels, and purpose-built defense ships that humanity had been quietly assembling for the past 2 decades, ever since the first confirmed detection of non-human artificial signals in the outer system had made it clear that they were not alone and that whoever else was out there had not come knocking yet. The Watch was not a government body. It drew from 17 different national agencies, 6 independent station authorities, and a rotating pool of private contractors, and it was held together by a combination of treaty obligations, shared communications infrastructure, and the stubborn conviction of the people who ran it, that if something was going to show up at humanity's door, humanity should be ready. It was chronically underfunded, politically contested, and, according to roughly half the governments that theoretically supported it, probably an overreaction. Davin had joined the Watch not because she was certain something was coming, but because she had looked at the math. She had sat with the data on signal intercepts, on anomalous readings in the outer belt, on the statistical improbability that a galaxy this old and this large was empty of everything but humanity, and she had concluded that the question was not whether contact would happen, but when. She had then spent the subsequent years arguing, cajoling, threatening, and occasionally lying to get the Watch the resources it needed, and when the Serethis Accord had appeared on long-range sensors, 6 days ago she had felt, beneath the cold focus of professional readiness, something very close to vindication. She had also felt something else, something that took her a moment to name, because it was complicated and she was a precise person who didn't enjoy complicated feelings during a crisis. What she felt was that the message she had received from the alien vessel, polite as it was, had told her everything she needed to know about how the other side of this conversation viewed what was happening. They had cited a legal framework she had never agreed to. They had described property rights she had never acknowledged. They had framed the retrieval as a formality, something already settled, and offered her the information as a courtesy, not as a request for her consent, but as a briefing on what was about to occur. They had not asked. They had not negotiated. They had informed. Davin had spent 11 years preparing for a threat that might never materialize, and she understood, in the bone-deep way that only experience can teach, that the most dangerous moment in any standoff is not when the other party is hostile. It is when the other party is so confident in their position that they have not even considered that you might refuse. She recalled all the Watch vessels currently performing outer system sweeps and repositioned them. She coordinated with the 3 orbital stations that carried weapons payloads to ensure overlapping coverage of the lunar threshold. She established a direct communication channel with every Watch commander in the system and delivered a briefing that was, by her own later estimation, possibly the clearest thing she had ever said in her professional life. They were not looking for a fight, but they were not going to stand down, and if the alien vessel crossed the threshold, they were to treat it as an incursion and respond with the full escalation protocol, starting with warning shots and ending wherever it had to end. She said the last part without drama because it didn't need drama. It was simply where the logic led. Then she sent another message to the Serethis Accord. This one was longer. She wrote it herself without assistance, and she was careful about every word. She explained that she understood the conclave considered this a legal matter, and that she was not questioning their internal framework. She said she could not speak to the legitimacy of laws she had not agreed to and had never been offered the opportunity to participate in forming. She said that the navigation anchor, whatever its registration status, was in orbit of her world, and that her world's security calculus could not permit foreign vessels to approach at will on the authority of documents she had no voice in creating. She said she recognized that the Serethis Accord was not a warship, and that she had no wish to harm its crew. She proposed an alternative. She would retrieve the anchor herself, verify that it posed no surveillance or intelligence-gathering risk, and deliver it to the boundary of the system within 30 days. She asked only that the Serethis Accord remain at the outer boundary during this period and that, at the conclusion of the 30 days, both parties could consider how to formalize some arrangement for future situations of this kind. She did not say please. She said it as one professional communicating with another, describing a workable solution to a shared problem. Osun read the message carefully. She read it a second time. Then she did something that her crew found unusual. She asked for their opinions, individually, before composing a response. She was not normally a consultative captain. But something in Davin's message had shifted the quality of the situation for her, and she could not immediately identify what it was. What her crew told her in various framings was that the humans appeared to be serious. The word serious came up in 4 of the 6 conversations. Not aggressive, not irrational, seriously. There was a quality to Davin's communication that resisted easy categorization. It acknowledged the asymmetry of the situation without accepting it, proposed a compromise without conceding the principle, and conveyed, underneath its careful neutrality, an absolute and complete willingness to pursue whatever outcome was necessary if the compromise was refused. Osun's navigation officer, a Drivathi whose species had an unusual sensitivity to subtext, put it most directly. She's not threatening us. She's informing us, the same way we informed her. Osun sat with that for a long time. She sent a message to the Conclave's Regional Administrative Office, flagging a new development and recommending a delay in any enforcement action pending review. She then composed a response to Davin that acknowledged receipt of the proposal and indicated that the Serethis Accord would maintain its current position pending direction from its governing authority. She was careful not to accept or reject the compromise because she did not have the authority to do either. What she did not report to the regional office, at least not in the formal filing, was her own assessment of the situation. She recorded it in her personal log instead, in the dry and precise language that characterized everything she committed to record. She wrote that the indigenous population of Helix 7 had exhibited an unexpected combination of technical capability, organizational coherence, and what she could only describe as institutional resolve, a willingness to absorb risk in defense of a principle that, from a purely material standpoint, they could not win. The navigation anchor had no value to them. Its retrieval posed no realistic threat to their security. But they had identified the precedent being set, that conclave-registered entities could approach their world unilaterally on the authority of conclave law, and they had decided that the precedent was the thing that mattered, not the object. She wrote, "They are not defending the anchor. They are defending the idea that no one can arrive at their door without their permission. They appear willing to fight for this, even knowing they would lose. I do not believe this is a miscalculation on their part. I believe they have assessed the cost and accepted it. This is not behavior I have encountered before." The conclave's review process eventually produced a recommendation. It took 61 days, which was actually quite fast by institutional standards, and reflected the fact that several people in the relevant departments had begun to understand that the situation was developing into something more complex than a retrieval dispute. The recommendation was that the Serethis Accord should not cross the established threshold without explicit authorization from the Species Contact Bureau, that the retrieval mandate should be formally suspended pending diplomatic review, and that a preliminary contact designation should be applied to the Helix 7 system's indigenous population, which would trigger the standard protocols for pre-contact species management. The Contact Bureau reached out to Davin's channel with a formal notification of the preliminary designation and an invitation to begin the registration process. Davin's response took 3 days, which the Contact Bureau initially interpreted as a communications delay and later realized was deliberate. When it came, it was longer than anything she had sent before. She had clearly not written it alone. The language carried the marks of multiple hands, the careful layering of legal and political argument that comes from committee drafting. She acknowledged the notification. She acknowledged the intention behind the contact designation, which she described as thoughtful. She then, with remarkable economy, declined it. She said humanity was grateful for the conclave's willingness to extend its frameworks to cover a new situation, but that the registration process implied integration into a structure humanity had not chosen, operating under laws humanity had not participated in creating, according to a timeline and set of criteria humanity had not agreed to. She said humanity was willing to talk, was, in fact, very interested in talking, but that the conversation needed to begin from a premise of mutual standing, not from a process designed by one party to evaluate whether the other party qualified for recognition. She said they were prepared to propose their own framework for the initial dialogue and to negotiate from there. Then she said one more thing, and it was this last part that Oswin, reviewing the message later, considered the most significant. Davin wrote, "We want to be clear that our objection is not to communication, contact, or even eventual cooperation. Our objection is to arriving at the table as a subject rather than a participant. We understand you have encountered this situation before, and we understand your frameworks exist for good reasons. We are not dismissing them. We are telling you that we will not begin a relationship to our species by accepting a position that frames us as less than what we are. We have 17 armed vessels in this system. We have the capacity to build more. We are willing to spend generations on this if that is what's required. We would much rather spend that time on something more productive. The choice of where to begin is yours." The final line was the one that eventually made its way into the conclave's internal review of the incident, which was formally titled Assessment of Initial Contact Protocols, Helix 7 Anomaly Report, and which remained, for the next several decades, required reading for every member of the Species Contact Bureau. The review noted that the indigenous population of Helix 7, designated as humans, had demonstrated an unusual profile that did not fit existing models for pre-contact species management. Most species, when encountered at a stage of development equivalent to humanity's, were either unaware of contact or insufficiently organized to mount a coherent response. Humans had been neither. They had been aware, they had been organized, and they had executed a response that, on review, was assessed as strategically sound, not because it threatened the conclave militarily, which it did not, but because it had correctly identified the institutional and political costs of forcing a retrieval against an organized and willing resistance, and had leveraged those costs to achieve a negotiating position that should not, by any reasonable metric, have been available to them. The review also noted in a section that several senior members of the Contact Bureau found uncomfortable to read that humanity's response had revealed a gap in the conclave's contact protocols. The protocols were designed around species that either accepted the conclave's framework upon contact or were incapable of resisting it. There was no pathway in the protocols for a species that refused the framework not out of ignorance, but out of considered principle. That understood the asymmetry of the situation and chose to contest it anyway, not because they expected to win immediately, but because they had calculated that the long-term cost of not contesting it was higher than the cost of resistance. The protocols had no category for this because, in the conclave's institutional memory, it had not happened before. It was happening now. Oswin submitted her own addendum to the review, which was included in the final document. It was brief. She wrote that in her assessment, the most significant thing about the human response was not its content, but its consistency. Every message Devon had sent, from the first warning through the final proposal, had communicated exactly the same thing in different words. We see what you're doing. We understand the gap between our positions, and we are not going to pretend that gap means we have no position. There had been no escalation in tone, no emotional volatility, no deviation from the central argument, just steady, repeated, patient insistence on being treated as something other than a problem to be managed. She wrote that she had found this, over the course of the 61 days, to be more unsettling than any threat she had encountered in 30 years of service, and that she believed it warranted careful attention going forward. The navigation anchor remained in orbit for another 4 months while the preliminary diplomatic framework was negotiated. Eventually, A small human crew retrieved it using one of the watch's outer belt vessels, conducted the requested verification scan in front of a conclave observer via live transmission, and delivered it to the boundary marker exactly as Davin had proposed, 23 days ahead of her original estimate. Osuan received the delivery, logged it into the retrieval record, and closed the original mandate. She sat in her pilot's chair for a while after, looking at the third planet on her long-range display, a blue and gray sphere, unremarkable at this distance, covered in atmosphere and water and whatever was down there, all the infrastructure of a species that had looked out at the stars and decided, before it even knew what was out there, that it was going to make them fight for every inch. She thought about Davin. She thought about the message that had taken 3 days to arrive. She thought about 17 armed vessels and the promise of more, and the phrase, willing to spend generations on this. She had spent 30 years moving through a galaxy that she understood. She knew its factions and its fault lines, its registered species and its contested zones and its bureaucratic rhythms. She knew what contact looked like, what resistance looked like, what a species at humanity's developmental stage was supposed to be capable of. She had a framework for the universe, and it had served her well. The thing that sat with her, that she carried out of the Helix 7 system and back toward conclave space, was not fear exactly. It was something quieter and more durable. It was the recognition that her framework had a gap in it, and that the gap was shaped exactly like a species that looked at an unjust situation and said simply, and without drama, no, not from a position of power, not with any realistic expectation of immediate success, just because the alternative, accepting the premise, was something they had decided, collectively and apparently irrevocably, they were not going to do. She did not know what humanity would become. She did not know what the negotiations would produce, or how long they would take, or what kind of relationship would eventually exist between her civilization and theirs. But she knew, with the certainty that comes from reading someone correctly, that whatever the universe had expected to find in Helix 7, whatever the Retrieval manifest had assumed it was sending her to, it had not expected this. It had expected a complication, a footnote, a pre-contact species that would need to be managed carefully, integrated slowly, introduced gradually to the reality of a galaxy that had been operating without them for a very long time. What it had found instead was a species that already knew the galaxy wasn't fair, had always suspected the galaxy wasn't fair, and had spent the intervening years building 17 ships and training people like Yale Davin, just in case. The conclave would adapt. Institutions always adapted, eventually. They would write new protocols and open new departments and hold long meetings about species contact philosophy and the nature of pre-integration standing. It would take time. It would be contentious. And humanity, Osuan suspected, would wait. Patiently, stubbornly, with more ships than before. That, she wrote in her final log entry for the mission, was what made them dangerous. Not the weapons, not the numbers, not even the willingness to fight. What made them dangerous was that they had looked at a galaxy full of older, larger, more powerful civilizations. A galaxy that had already decided how things worked, and they had not been afraid of it. They had been annoyed by it. There was a difference, and it was a difference that the conclave's frameworks had no word for because they had never needed one before. They had one now.